Hi, my name is Eugenia and welcome back to my channel. I know that many people want to start writing, whether they see it as a hobby or as their potential career. However, for many people, it's also the case that they're unhappy with their writing skills. They expect themselves to be better writers than they actually are. Good news is that it's not a big issue and you can easily fix that. Bad news is that you will have to watch till the end of this video to learn how. Now that I got you hooked, I'm gonna spill the tea. Good writing doesn't come from talent alone. And even the most brilliant authors of all times have had years and years of practice before their big breakthrough. So practice is gonna be the topic of our today's video. In fact, it's gonna be a mini series where we'll take a look at different authors and some of their novels or longer texts so we can search for some insights into what make their writing style so unique and memorable. We're not going to be analyzing their whole literary career, their biography, or even the meaning of the book. We will refer to some historical context or the meaning of the scenes that I will choose if it helps us understand their writing style. Today we're going to be using J.R.R. Tolkien's famous book, The Lord of the Rings, as our writing example. The first thing you might notice when you start reading the book is how much less timely it feels compared to other books written during the same period. Think of any novel by Ernest Hemingway, Herman Hesse, or even Virginia Woolf, even though she was writing way earlier before The Lord of the Rings was even conceived. This tendency might stem from the fact that The Lord of the Rings is a book written in the fantasy genre. Another possible explanation is the book was pretty much inspired by medieval literature, especially English medieval literature, and was supposed to reflect some of it in its text. If you watched my other video on how to write any text possible, then you know that I identify 3 building blocks of text of all genres. Those are pace, depth, and the level of language complexity. So what we see in The Lord of the Rings is that Tolkien uses a lot of depth to serve the level of complexity. In other words, he builds a lot of context not only to slow down the pace and create pretty much a new setup, but also to map out his audience and make sure that his book is being read by a person who's supposed to read this book. So you can imagine that he was thinking of linguists, people interested in folklore and medieval literatures, people with similar values as the main reading group of The Lord of the Rings. And this is our first insight, using context to help and support the level of language complexity. The other insight goes right after it, and it's using the level of complexity to filter out your audience and make sure that only people who are supposed to read your book are capable of reading your book. The language of Lord of the Rings is not only advanced, it's also rather old-fashioned. The way people address each other, the way they have dialogue, or even the topics they choose to be worthy of discussion, all of it might sound funny to a non-accustomed ear. On the other hand, those who love folklore or medieval literature or history will find a lot of joy in all the details and similarities between The Lord of the Rings and the way text used to be written 1,000 years ago. Now let's move on to the 2 scenes I have chosen as a good example of Tolkien's writing style. In a way, they are polar opposites of each other, as not only they represent different feelings, but they also mark different points in the story. The first one happens in the book 2, chapter 7, in the very beginning of the chapter 7, when the 4 hobbits enter the house of Tom Bombadil. The funny thing is, there is an unspoken writing rule that says you shouldn't use any descriptors, so adjectives, adverbs, any longer phrases or sentences that are adjacent to a noun or a verb. So you shouldn't use any of these unless it's absolutely necessary. Tolkien, however, neglects this rule quite often, if not all the time. For example, we see here they were in a long, low room filled with the light of lamps swinging from the beams of the roof. So the room is already described as long and low, and then there is another sentence that describes it even in more detail, filled with the light of lamps, and then the lamps are described as swinging from the beams of the roof. So this long sentence is used to describe one single place the four hobbits have just entered. In all honesty, it would be enough to simply say that the hobbits have entered a low, lone room with a lot of light. But Tolkien decides to give us way more context, which I believe he finds necessary to convey a certain feeling. Now, further down the text, when they start bowing low to Goldberry, we see them being described as feeling strangely surprised and awkward, like folk that knocking at a cottage door to beg for a drink of water have been answered by a fair young elf queen clad in living flowers. So what Tolkien does here, he not only lets us know that the characters were feeling uncomfortable, but he also weaves an element of world building into creating this feeling. He gives us an analogy by using examples that would only be possible in the realm of the Lord of the Rings. And then further down another sentence that uses a similar tactic. Fair Lady Goldberry, said Frodo at last, feeling his heart moved with a joy that he did not understand. He stood as he had at times stood enchanted by fair elven voices, but the spell that was now laid upon him was different. Less keen and lofty was the delight, but deeper and nearer to mortal heart. Marvelous and yet not strange. We have one full sentence filled with the details of the world just to give us an understanding of how the character felt. Under any other circumstances or in any other book, this analogy wouldn't work. But in The Lord of the Rings, not only it makes sense, but it also makes us sympathize with Frodo. And that, I believe, is another characteristic of Tolkien's writing style. He overwhelms you with the detail to convey a certain feeling. To confirm this hypothesis, we now have to move on to the second scene I have chosen. This one takes place almost at the end of the book, right before the battle with Mordor. So the first thing Tolkien does is sets up the tone. It reads here as, "It was some 100 miles by that way from the crossroads to the Morannon, and what might befall them before they came so far, none knew." Then he proceeds by describing how the army was structured. The one openly but heedfully, with mounted scouts before them on the road and others on foot upon either side, especially on the eastward flank, for there lay dark thickets and the tumbled land of rocky gillies and crags, pardon my pronunciation, behind which the long grim slopes of the Efelduod clambered up. By showing us how people were marching, he lets us know that they were pretty much scared, expecting a sudden attack any moment, but he doesn't state it, he just paints the picture. Then he proceeds by claiming that even though the weather was nice, it failed at cheering up people. The weather of the world remained fair, and the wind held in the west, but nothing could waft away the glooms and the sad mists that clung about the mountains of shadow. In the third paragraph, Tolkien already states that the emotion the people were feeling is fear. Though they marched in seeming peace, the hearts of all the army, from the highest to the lowest, were downcast. And with every mile that they went north, foreboding of evil grew heavier on them. And the feeling only grows darker. He proceeds to describe that the quick victory the army had did not manage to cheer them up. On the contrary, it made them feel more fearful and uncertain, as if they were fooled by the Mordor's army. And finally, at the very end, he states the feeling once again as to confirm his own assumptions. Once again, we see here a great example of offering a lot of detail that's rooted in the world-building strategy to convey a certain emotion. In this case, it's fear. Tolkien doesn't seem to be a big fan of naming emotions. Instead, he lets the scene to speak for itself. The action of characters, their choice of words, how they perceived the weather, all of it is supposed to convey the feelings and make us emphasize with characters more. Now that we found out some characteristics of Tolkien's writing style, let's create some text. So, how would I implement Tolkien's methodology into my own strategy? I would create two tables. The first one would be about world building. So, I would write down all the information I have for different classes of characters. For example, those can be elves, wizards, orcs, elves, and so on and so forth. And then I write down their weaknesses, their strengths, their typical alliances, their typical enemies. You can add as much information as will be useful for you. And then you can use this information for, well, world building. You can go for a typical setting where your creations would behave, surprise, surprise, stereotypically. Or if you're aiming for certain comic effects, then you might have your characters behaving atypically. For example, your orc character might befriend a wizard, and that's how the whole story will kick off. And then you can have phrases like, oh, for an orc, you're very friendly and very loyal. So once you have this world building table, you can not only build the world, but you can also use these components to create similar analogies as Tolkien provides when he tries to describe the feeling of his characters. The second table would be about your characters per se, so I would just write down the name of the character, their background, once again, their weaknesses, strengths. They might take something from their class and they might have something on their own. So this table is supposed to help you to keep track of your characters and to know what would be the best interaction between different characters, what would be in this character's nature, how would they react in a certain situation, what would they say. All of this information will be then your building blocks when you create your text, your novel, or your short story. Alternatively, if you're not a big fan of fantasy, you can still implement some techniques to create a more realistic story. For example, you can use a tactic to add extra detail to convey a certain emotion. Let's say I want to describe the feeling of sadness that my character is about to experience when she realizes that her mother is about to die. I'm literally taking this example from the top of my head, and it might be a bit too dramatic or too exaggerated. Just please bear with me. I'm only writing these examples for the sake of this video. So that's how my scene is gonna look like if I'm just writing it as my inspiration comes. Maybe I would add a bit more details here and there, but the skeleton would remain the same. And now I'm going to use the same logic we have just seen in one of Tolkien's scenes. So first, I'm gonna set up the scene by describing how it would look to my character. I'm gonna say that her mother looked very pale and skinny, and that was very uncommon to her, and that really worried my character. Then I'm going to convey the same emotion through the action my character takes. So she's gonna walk to a chair, and the way she's walking is representative of her feelings. For contrast, I'm gonna describe the receptionist she sees, and the way this receptionist is a complete opposite of her mother on her deathbed. Then I'm gonna add a bit more context. I'm gonna describe the weather. I'm gonna describe that it made my character feel even more sad. I'm gonna describe how some other patients are feeling and that they're doing better, and that's the total opposite of how the character's mother is doing. And then at the very end, I'm gonna claim the emotion that she feels. I'm gonna say what is her main fear. So that's how the scene looks like after twisting and twitching it following Tolkien's principle. I'm pretty sure that it looks better than the first version, and it probably looks better than what I could have come up with if I just followed my inspiration. And this is it. We identified some of the characteristics of Tolkien's writing style, and we used those to improve our own. Hope you found this video useful, and I'll see you next time. Have a productive writing session, and bye-bye.